A flight attendant kicked a black woman out of first class. She was shocked shortly after. In this riveting video, we delve into an unexpected incident that unfolded mid-air, leaving passengers and crew members alike in disbelief. It began when a flight attendant confronted an elderly black woman seated in first class, asking her to vacate the seat. Witnesses were taken aback, unsure of the sit situations unfolding. We'd love to hear. If you're excited about this story, if you had a good time watching the video, go ahead and press 1. If that's not the case, just press 0. Your feedback truly motivates me to collect more heartwarming and significant stories. Aliyah Johnson stepped onto the plane, the rhythmic click of her heels echoing off the polished floors as she adjusted the strap of her designer laptop bag. First-class accommodations were a privilege she'd earned after years of relentless work and sleepless nights. This wasn't new to her, but every time she settled into the plush seat, it was a quiet reminder of her success. Sliding her bag under the seat, Aliyah pulled out her phone and scrolled through her packed calendar. A multi-million-dollar civil rights case awaited her later in the week. A high-stakes challenge she was prepared to face. For now, this flight was her brief reprieve. She leaned back, closed her eyes, and let the soft hum of the engines and faint cabin chatter wash over her, but her peace was short-lived. "Ma'am," came a sharply polite voice. Aliyah opened her eyes to see a flight attendant standing at her row. The woman was in her mid-40s. Her blonde hair twisted neatly into place, her uniform perfectly pressed. She exuded authority, but the tightness of her smile and sharpness of her tone made the interaction feel less routine. "May I see your ticket, please?" The woman asked, her voice clipped yet overly polite. Aliyah handed it over without hesitation. The flight attendant, whose name tag read Natalie Parker, scrutinized the ticket for longer than necessary, her lips tightening into a thin line. "Ah," Natalie murmured, handing it back. "I just needed to check. Sometimes passengers get confused about their seating." "Not me," Aliyah said calmly, her voice steady. "I know exactly where I'm supposed to be." "Of course," Natalie replied with a strained laugh, though the tightness in her smile lingered. She stood for a beat too long, then moved on, muttering under her breath. "Well, first class certainly isn't what it used to be." Aliyah froze for a moment, but chose to let the comment slide. Instead, turning her attention to the blinking email notification on her phone, she wasn't here to make a scene. Yet the microaggressions continue, as Natalie made her rounds. Aliyah noticed the subtle glances and small inconveniences, delays in service at her row, and an accidental bump to her tray table, spilling a splash of water onto her lap. At first, she tried to believe it was unintentional, but the whispers she overheard between Natalie and another flight attendant confirmed her instincts. "Double check. If she's even supposed to be here," Natalie said, her voice hushed, but not enough to escape Aliyah's key ears. "We can't take chances." These days, it was barely 15 minutes into the flight when Natalie's hostility turned overt. She reappeared at Aliyah's row. Her smile stretched tight once again, clipboard in hand. "Excuse me, Momum," she began, her tone adopting a rehearsed professionalism. "I need to speak to you about your seat." Aliyah raised an eyebrow, propping herself up slightly in her chair. "Is there a problem?" she asked, the boarding pass still tucked neatly into her blazer pocket. "Well," Natalie said, her forced smile slipping, "it appears there may have been an error with your seating assignment. Would you mind moving to the main cabin? We ensure your comfort there." Aliyah's lips curled into a polite but firm smile. "This is the seat I paid for. If there's an error, you should check with the person who assigned the seat, because it's not me." A faint blush crept across Natalie's cheeks as she adjusted the clipboard in her hands, her composure briefly faltering. "It's a simple misunderstanding," Natalie insisted, her voice barely concealing her frustration. "I'm sure we can resolve this without any fuss." "I agree," Aliyah said with measured calm. "There's no fuss. I'm staying in my assigned seat." The nearby passengers began to take notice. A man in the adjacent row lowered his tablet, glancing curiously between Natalie and Aliyah. Another passenger leaned toward a seatmate, whispering. The growing attention only seemed to irritate Natalie, further leaning slightly closer. Natalie dropped, her voice an octave look. She said, an edge creeping into her tone. We both know how these things happen. Sometimes people end up in the wrong place, even if it's not intentional. I'm just trying to make sure everything is in order. Aaliyah's stomach tightened, but she refused to waver people like me. You mean, she replied, her voice cutting through the low hum of the cabin. Natalie blinked, her expression shifting from surprise to defensiveness. That's not what I said. She snapped. Don't put words in my mouth. No, Aaliyah said, calm yet unwavering, but it's exactly what you implied. A ripple of murmurs spread through first-class Natalie's forced smile evaporated, replaced by my frustration and a white-knuckled grip on her clipboard. The tension was palpable. I'm giving you a chance to resolve this quietly. Natalie hissed, lowering her voice further. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. Aaliyah leaned back in her seat, her calm demeanor intact. The only person making this hard is you. If you're done harassing me, I'd like to enjoy my flight. Just then the captain's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing their cruising altitude. Natalie hesitated before straightening and retreating down the aisle, her jaw tight with unspoken frustration. Aaliyah exhaled slowly, her pulse steady, but her guard up. She could feel the blend of stares around her, some sympathetic, others indifferent, and a few thinly veiled in hostility. But she didn't care. She wasn't going anywhere. Minutes passed, but Natalie's absence didn't last this time. She returned with another flight attendant, a visibly nervous younger woman. She's refusing to move, Natalie said sharply, though she kept her voice low enough to avoid drawing attention from the cockpit. I need you to back me up. The younger attendant hesitated, her eyes darting between Aaliyah and the clipboard in Natalie's hands. I don't think this is just do your job. Natalie snapped, cutting off her hesitance. Aaliyah folded her arms, her patience wearing thin. Let me save you some time, she said coolly. If you plan to escalate this, go right ahead. My lawyer would love to hear how your airline treats paying customers. Nearby passengers leaned in, openly curious. Now, Natalie stiffened, her confidence cracking under the public scrutiny. Still, she leaned down one last time. You people always make everything about race. She hissed, her voice cold and venomous. I'm just doing my job. Aaliyah locked out with her unflinching, and I'm just sitting in my seat. If you have a problem with that, I suggest you take it up with someone who cares. Natalie straightened abruptly, her face blotchy with anger, mouth tightening into a thin line. She turned sharply and stormed down the aisle. Aaliyah let out a measured breath, her heart steady. Despite the tension lingering in the cabin, the eyes of the other passengers stayed on her, some supportive, some indifferent, others openly judging, but none of it mattered. Aaliyah wasn't moving. This was her seat, and she refused to back down. I paid for this seat, and I'm not moving, Aaliyah said firmly, her gaze locked on Natalie. The flight attendant's practiced smile faltered, giving way to visible irritation. I understand you feel entitled to this seat, Natalie replied, her tone tight, but I'm telling you there's been a mistake. Aaliyah's patience snape-spepped. Let me be perfectly clear, she said, her voice cutting through the rising tension. The only mistake here is how you're treating me. I'm not moving. Natalie leaned in, lowering her voice as her composure began to crack. You don't get to talk to me like that, she hissed. I'm trying to do my job, but of course, people like you always have to make a scene. The air around them seemed to freeze. Aaliyah's heart pounded, but she forced herself to remain calm as she spoke, her voice steady. And what exactly do you mean by people like me? Natalie's face wrined, her lips twitching, as if searching for a retort. You know exactly what I mean, she said, her voice wobbling with agitation. Nearby passengers, until now silent observers, began to murmur. Gazes bounced between the two women. An older man in a business suit cleared his throat audibly, but Natalie ignored him entirely, her focus fixed on Aaliyah. You're being unreasonable, Natalie said, her voice louder. Now, as though trying to draw support from the surrounding passengers, it's not that complicated. We can resolve this quickly if you just cooperate. Aaliyah crossed her arms. Cooperate with what? Your blatant racism. Her words cut through the cabin like a blade. Natalie recoiled, her mouth dropping in disbelief. "Excuse me, how dare you accuse me of something like that?" "I dare," Alea replied, her tone calm but sharp, "'cause that's exactly what this is. You haven't targeted anyone else in this cabin. Just me, and everyone here knows it." Silence hung in the air, heavy and charged, until another voice broke through. "She's right," said a middle-aged woman, 2 rows back. Her voice was soft but resolute. "I've been watching the whole time you're singling her out." Natalie's head snapped toward the woman, her eyes narrowing. "This has nothing to do with anyone else," she said, her voice quivering with both anger and desperation. "I'm simply following protocol." The woman crossed her arms. "Sure you are, and I suppose protocol includes muttering about her under your breath." "I heard you loud and clear." A ripple of agreement surged through the passengers. The tone of the whispers shifted, many now openly questioning Natalie's actions. A few sided with "ah," while others murmured about staying out of it entirely, Natalie's professionalism. Once a facade of control was rapidly unraveling. She turned her eyes toward the galley, looking for backup, but the younger flight attendant who had earlier shadowed her avoided eye contact and quietly disappeared into the aisle. Meanwhile, Michael Rivera, seated in coach, adjusted his camera and continued recording. He had his lens trained on the T. Standoff from the very beginning, his instincts telling him this moment demanded to be documented. Natalie's voice rose above the chatter. "I don't have to explain myself to any of you. I'm in charge of this cabin, and I'll decide what's appropriate." Alea met her gaze steadily. "No, what you'll do is stop harassing me and do your job, unless, of course, you'd like me to escalate this further." Natalie blinked, clearly taken aback by Alea's unwavering composure, but quickly recovered. "You want to escalate this? Fine. I'll bring the captain into this." "Please do," Alea responded evenly, gesturing toward the cockpit door. "Let's see how far you're willing to take this." Natalie hesitated, glaring at Alea before turning sharply on her heel and stalking toward the front of the plane. Her heels clicked against the floor, punctuating her retreat as she disappeared down the aisle. The murmurs among the passengers grew louder, many now openly discussing the blatant unfairness of the situation. Alea exhaled, her pulse still pounding in her ears. She wasn't one to shy away from confrontation, but Natalie's actions had left her feeling exposed in a way she hadn't expected. She locked eyes with the woman who had spoken up earlier and gave her a small, grateful nod a few moments later. Natalie returned this time with the captain. His expression was a mixture of irritation and fatigue, his movements deliberate as he approached Alea's seat. "What seems to be the issue here?" he asked, his tone tinged with weariness. Natalie launched into a carefully rehearsed explanation, painting Alea as uncooperative and disruptive. But before she could finish, Alea interrupted her captain. "I'm happy to clarify," Alea said, her voice steady. "I'm sitting in the seat I paid for, and this flight attendant has been harassing me from the moment I stepped on this plane. Her behavior is unacceptable, and I have witnesses who can corroborate." The captain's frown deepened, his gaze flicking between Alea and Natalie. "Is that true?" he asked the passengers. Several heads nodded in unison, and one man spoke up. "I've seen everything. She's been targeting her for no reason." Natalie's face turned, beet red, her lips moved, but no sound came out as she struggled to respond. "I see," the captain said. Finally, his tone cool, his eyes went back to Natalie. "Miss Parker, can I speak to you in the galley?" Natalie stiffened, her hands clutching her clipboard like a lifeline. She opened her mouth to protest, but caught the sharpness in the captain's tone. Defeated, she turned and followed him toward the galley, leaving Alea momentarily in peace. When the captain returned, his expression was carefully neutral, though the tension in his posture betrayed his frustration. He approached Alea, his tone measured but strained. "Miss Johnson," he said, "I understand. There's been a misunderstanding. With your seat assignment, Miss Parker has raised concerns about an irregular booking to ensure there are no further disruptions for the other passengers. I kindly ask that you move to a seat in the main cabin." Alea's eyes narrowed. "Let me get this straight." She said, "You're asking me, a paying customer, to move because your flight attendant can't stomach seeing me in this seat." The captain's jaw tightened his professional facade, slipping for just a moment. "I asking for your cooperation to ensure the flight proceeds smoothly." Aaliyah repeated her tone. Sharp. "The only disruption here is the blatant racism I've been subjected to. Since I boarded this plane, I refuse to be punished for her behavior." Before the captain could respond, Natalie reappeared, her clipboard clutched in her hand and a smug expression crossing her face. "Captain," she interjected, "I've just confirmed with Corpet Mrs. Johnson's seat was flagged due to a glitch in the booking system. It wasn't officially cleared for her use." Aaliyah froze, anger rising like a tidal wave within her. "This is outrageous," she said, her voice low and controlled, but warning of the storm beneath Natalie's voice dripped with false sympathy. "These things happen. We're happy to accommodate you in the main cabin and, of course, offer a voucher for the inconvenience." The murmurs in the cabin grew louder. Some passengers now fully engaged in discussing the injustice unfolding before them. Aaliyah felt the weight of every gaze, the intensity of the moment, pressing in on her. "You can't be serious." Aaliyah said, her voice firm. "This is nothing more than yet another attempt to humiliate me." Natalie leaned in slightly, her words quiet but venomous. "If you don't move now, I'll have security waiting for you when we land. Your choice." Aaliyah's resolve briefly faltered, images flashing through her mind, headlines twisting the story. Her dignity dragged through the mud with a deep breath. She stood tall, her voice steady as she said, "I'll move. But not because you're right, only because this isn't over. And when I finish with this, you'll wish you'd handled it differently." Natalie's smirk faltered, but Araya didn't give her the satisfaction of a second glance. She grabbed her bag and walked down the aisle, her head held high, despite the humiliation pressing down on her. Whispers followed her, but she refused to look back as she reached the main cabin. Michael Rivera stood from his seat, his voice cutting through the growing hum. "This isn't right," he said, his tone clear and unyielding. "Everyone saw what just happened. Don't think for a second. This won't go." Public Aaliyah met his gaze and gave a small nod of thanks before settling into her new seat. Her heart raced, her hands trembling slightly as she opened her laptop, but her determination cut through the haze of anger and humiliation. Her fingers began moving furiously across the keyboard, documenting every detail of what had just transpired. This story wasn't over, not by a long shot. The plane tilted slightly as it soared westward. The hum of the engine, steady, masking the tension inside. First class was far from serene, while Natalie might have won this battle. Aaliyah had no intention of losing the war. The passengers around them exchanged uneasy glances, whispers of discontent growing louder with each passing minute in his seat. Michael Rivera kept recording, his phone angled discreetly as his camera captured the unfolding drama. His lens followed Natalie as she strutted down the aisle, her expression a mix of smugness and forced composure, but the cracks were starting to show. The murmurs of disapproval around her grew louder as passengers began standing up for what they'd witnessed. Natalie returned to the galley, only to be confronted by a middle-aged woman, her patience frayed from watching too much. "You should be ashamed of yourself." The woman hissed, her voice sharp enough to carry through to the passengers nearby. "This isn't going to end well for you." Natalie flinched slightly, but quickly pasted on her professional mask. "Ma'am, please don't ma'am me," the woman snapped. "You think this attitude is going unnoticed? Think again, though." Natalie brushed the confrontation off, her confidence visibly wavered. By now, the seeds of resistance had been planted at that moment. The tide of the cabin was shifting. In the main cabin, Aaliyah sat rigid in her cramped seat, her laptop open atop the flimsy tray table. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, her thoughts pouring out as she meticulously documented everything. Every pointed remark from Natalie, the captain's feeble attempts to smooth things over, and the humiliation of being forced out of the seat she'd rightfully purchased. It all went into her outline around her passengers, occasionally glanced her way, stealing looks filled with curiosity, sympathy, or, in a few rare cases, disapproval. Their muted whispers blended with the hum of the engines, but Aaliyah ignored them. Her focus was unshakable. She was determined not to let what happened stay buried in this flight back in first class. Michael continued. Recording in his camera followed Natalie's movements as her demeanor shifted from smug confidence to strained nervousness. Her tight-lipped smile faltered. Each time her eyes fell on a passenger glaring at her, the older woman who had challenged her flicked the call button above her seat. Natalie took a deep breath, straightened her posture, and approached her with a brittle smile. "Yes, ma'am. How can I help you?" Natalie said in a syrupy tone, her voice laced with practiced sweetness. The woman didn't flinch. "You can explain why you thought it was appropriate to demean that woman earlier," she demanded. Her words rang clear, cutting through the low buzz of conversation in the cabin. "I'm not sure. I know what you're referring to," Natalie replied, her professional mask slipping just slightly. The woman cut her off. "Oh, spare me. We all saw it. You've been targeting that woman since she boarded, and honestly, it's disgusting. I'm appalled this airline allows someone like you to behave this way." Scattered murmur of agreement rippled through the cabin. A faint blush crept over Natalie's cheeks as her polished exterior began to crumble. "Further, I was following protocol," she said tensely, struggling to maintain control. "We have seat assignments, and threatening to call security was part of your protocol." The woman interrupted, her voice sharp with incredulity. "You've been muttering about her under your breath." "This entire flight," we all heard it at this. Another passenger spoke up from across the aisle, a younger man. "This time, yeah. I heard it too," he said pointedly. "You crossed a line." Natalie whipped her head toward the man, her mask completely slipping. "I don't need to explain myself to you," she snapped, her voice tinged with indignation. The middle-aged woman wasn't finished. "You may not need to explain yourself to him," she said coolly, "but you'll have a lot to answer for when this goes public." Natalie's eyes darted toward Michael. By now, he wasn't even pretending to be subtle. His phone was held in plain sight. The camera pointed straight at her. Her face paled, the full weight of everything setting in. She spun on her heel and stormed back to the galley, her muttered curses barely audible over the noise of the cabin. In the main cabin, Aaliyah's phone buzzed on her tray table. She glanced down and saw a text from an unfamiliar number. "I've got everything on video. This isn't over, stay strong." Michael, for the first time in hours, Aaliyah allowed herself a small smile. A flicker of hope kindled in her chest. She typed back quickly, "Thank you. I've been documenting everything I can too." The last few hours of the flight passed in uneasy silence. Natalie disappeared into the galley, avoiding passengers whenever possible. Aaliyah stayed laser-focused on her keyboard, her screen a growing document filled with details of everything that had transpired. Every so often, Michael glanced back toward her and offered a brief nod of solidarity, reassuring her without words. When the captain announced that they were beginning their descent into Los Angeles, the cabin seemed to hold its collective breath. Natalie emerged from the galley, her face schooled into an expression of neutrality as she prepared for landing. But as she moved down the aisle, she avoided eye contact with nearly everyone. Aaliyah noticed the brief flicker of apprehension in her eyes as she passed by the plane, touched down, and taxied toward the gate. While passengers rose to grab their bags and file out, Aaliyah sat still, her thoughts sharpening. The battle wasn't over. It was only beginning. She closed her laptop, slid it into her bag, and prepared herself for whatever lay ahead up in first class. Michael powered off his camera, his expression one of quiet satisfaction. He had all the evidence he needed to expose the truth. The whispers of passengers around him suggested they wouldn't be the only ones telling this story. As the first passengers began stepping off the plane, Aaliyah noticed the young flight attendant from earlier walking toward her hesitantly. She glanced over her shoulder nervously before leaning in to speak. "I just wanted to say," the attendant started, her voice low. "I'm sorry for what happened to you. It wasn't fair." Aaliyah looked at her, gauging her sincerity. Then why didn't you say anything? She asked calmly, the younger woman's shoulders sagged. I was scared. Natalie can be difficult. Alia's voice stayed firm. Fear doesn't excuse your silence. You let this happen. The attendant nodded, shamefaced. You're right, she whispered. I should have said something. Alia didn't linger in the conversation without another word. She picked up her belongings and made her way toward the jet bridge. At its threshold, Natalie stood, her professional mask firmly back in place, though the cracks were still visible. Have a good day, Natalie said flatly, her eyes darting away. Alia stopped, her voice low but steady. Remember this day, she said. It'll stay with you. Natalie stiffened, but didn't respond, and Alia walked past her. Without looking back in the terminal, a small group of passengers had gathered near the gate. Their faces, a mix of curiosity and concern. Michael stood nearby, talking animatedly with a woman holding a notepad. His camera hung conspicuously around his neck, as though ready to record again, catching his eye. Alia offered him a small, resolute nod. Whatever battle lay ahead, she wouldn't face it alone. Alia slowed her pace as she approached, her gaze fixed on Michael, who noticed her immediately with an inviting wave. He raised his voice just enough to command the attention of the surrounding crowd. Miss Johnson. He called out, his tone firm but encouraging. Would you like to say something about what happened? The nearby passengers turned toward her, their quiet murmur suddenly louder. Charged with curiosity, Alia hesitated, overwhelmed by the weight of their eyes on her. It was a moment she could have let pass, one that could slip away if she allowed fear to take hold. But then the sting of Natalie's smirk came, rushing back her cold remarks, the whispered echoes of prejudice and the humiliation she'd endured. This wasn't just her fight anymore. It was bigger than that, straightening her back. She lifted her chin and met the crowd's gaze head on, her voice, steady and purposeful, cut through the murmurs. What happened on that flight was unacceptable. She began, her conviction resonating in every syllable. I was targeted and humiliated because of someone else's prejudice. I deserve better, and so does everyone who flies with this airline. Michael's camera was already rolling, capturing the fire. In her words, this isn't just about me. Alia continued, her eyes scanning the group before her. It's about accountability. A ripple of reaction passed through the crowd. A few passengers nodded. In agreement, clapping quietly, the woman with the notepad scribbled furiously, her brow furrowed in concentration, and then, like ice cracking under pressure, Natalie appeared from the jet bridge. Her face was pale. Her lips pressed together in a tight, wavering line. Her eyes darted over the group, narrowing as she caught sight of Michael's camera. Natalie Parker, Michael said, stepping forward, his voice calm but pointed. Do you have anything to say about your treatment of Ms. Johnson during the flight? Natalie froze for a moment. Alia could see the cracks breaking through the flight attendant's facade as her lips tightened, holding back words. She didn't want to say. Finally, she snapped. No comment. Her tone was clipped, but her voice betrayed her discomfort with hurried steps. She headed toward the exit, attempting to escape the layer of judgment thickening around her. Behind her, Michael's camera followed, steady and unyielding. Like a truth. Seeking glare, onlookers shouted questions, their voices tinged with both anger and curiosity. Alia didn't move, watching Natalie's retreat with a small flicker of satisfaction. That sense of smugness Natalie once wore so boldly had evaporated. Alia could tell she was no longer in control, and she wouldn't be able to hide from the consequences. Now nearby, Alia's phone buzzed. In her hand, she glanced down at the screen and immediately noticed the notification from a social media platform. A hashtag popped up beneath it. Flying while black. Alia clicked on it, and in an instant, the flood of messages hit her. Hundreds of comments. Angry, empathetic, outraged, poured into Michael's early footage of the incident, already making waves online. The posts were filled with demands for accountability, calls for justice, and personal stories from strangers who had endured similar treatment. Alia's breath caught briefly in her chest. Strangers, people she had never met, were standing with her. This wasn't just her story anymore. It was becoming a collective fight. It was fuel igniting her resolve. This is only the beginning, she murmured to herself. Natali wouldn't escape the consequences of her actions, and the airline, they couldn't rely on their policies as shields from accountability anymore. When she looked up, Michael's eyes met hers, his face still focused as he reviewed the footage on his camera. Aaliyah gave him a curt but appreciative nod, and he returned it. Quiet understanding passing between them. This wasn't over, but there was relief in knowing she wasn't carrying this weight alone anymore. More outside Los Angeles. Air-kissed, her skin brisk but refreshing, snapping her fully back to the present. Her phone buzzed again and again, a relentless feed of notifications that displayed the video's unstoppable momentum. Yet as powerful as the movement felt in that moment, it was also overwhelming. Aaliyah, the voice behind her, cut through her spiraling thoughts. She turned to see Michael jogging to catch up. His camera still hung over his chest, like a badge of purpose. "I'm glad I caught you," he said, breathless but steady. His brows furrowed in thought, concern underlying his words. "Look, I just want to say I'm sorry for what you had to go through back there. It was disgusting. Truly, I've uploaded all the footage I captured. It's already going viral." Aaliyah said nothing for a beat, measuring his words. Carefully, gratitude rose in her, but with it came a hint of unease. Her eyes hardened slightly. "Why are you doing this?" she asked bluntly. "What's in it for you?" Michael hesitated, his honesty settling into his expression before he replied, "Sure, I'm a journalist. This is what I do. But I'm also just someone who's sick of seeing stories like this over and over again. If I can make a difference by exposing the truth, then I have to." It wasn't a perfect answer, but there was no denying the sincerity in his voice. Aaliyah nodded slowly. "Thank you," she said simply. "I appreciate it." As they continued walking toward baggage claim, Michael glanced at his phone, his expression darkening. "It's not just the footage. That's going viral." He said, "People are digging into her history. Natali Parker. I mean, there are other complaints against her." Aaliyah stopped mid-step, the words jolting her. "What other complaints?" Michael lowered his voice, his tone grim. "Passengers have accused her of targeting people before, though it seems like those incidents were brushed under the rug. None of them became public until now." Aaliyah's jaw tightened, her voice low and furious. "Of course, they were brushed under the rug. That's how these things always go." Michael placed a steadying hand on her shoulder, his gaze unwavering. "Not this time. Aaliyah, things are different. Now you have people standing with you and the airline knows it." They're scrambling before Aaliyah could respond. Her phone buzzed again. This time a call. The screen displayed the airline's customer service number for a moment. She hesitated, gripping the phone tightly before taking a breath and answering. "This is Aaliyah Johnson." Miss Johnson came, a clipped but professional voice. On the other end, "This is Rachel Bennett from Airline Name's legal department. We aware of the incident on today's flight and would like to discuss a resolution." Aaliyah's lips thinned. "A resolution," she repeated flatly. "I don't think an apology and a voucher are going to cut it." There was silence on the line before Rachel responded, measured and deliberate. "We're prepared to discuss compensation, but we'd appreciate it if you refrained from making public statements while we conduct our investigation." A sharp laugh escaped Aaliyah's lips. "Publicity. That's what you're worried about. Not the fact that I was humiliated and discriminated against. Your flight attendant acted with blatant racism. Do you really think throwing money at me is going to make it go away?" "Miss Johnson, we take these matters very seriously," Rachel began. But Aaliyah interrupted, her voice rising sharp and cold. "If you cared," she said, "you wouldn't need a trending hashtag to deal with this. Get back to me when you're ready to do better." Before Rachel could respond, Aaliyah hung up her hands, trembled slightly as the weight of her anger said through her, but her resolve had only deepened. Michael studied her carefully, his expression calm but admiring. "You okay?" he asked quietly. Aaliyah squared her shoulders, her voice firm. "I'm fine. They're scared, which means we're finally getting somewhere." When they reached the baggage claim, a cluster of reporters waited near the exit cameras, rolling the moment. Aaliyah came into view. Michael glanced at her. "You don't need to talk to them if you're not ready." Aaliyah took a steady breath, her back straightening. "Yes, I do," she replied. "This isn't just about me anymore." She stepped forward, steeling herself as the chaos of questions surrounded her with each word. She spoke measured, firm, and filled with purpose. Aaliyah's story transformed into more than a personal fight. It was now a movement, and she wasn't backing down. Aaliyah's thoughts were interrupted by the vibration of an incoming call. Glancing at the screen, she noticed an unfamiliar number. Hesitant, she answered cautiously. "This is Aaliyah Johnson, Miss Johnson. This is Sharon Goodman." The other voice said briskly. "I, a reporter with the Daily Sentinel, I'm covering the growing backlash against the airline following today's incident. Do you have a moment to comment?" Aaliyah paused, unsure just how much she wanted to reveal, yet she knew the value of steering the narrative rather than letting others spin their own version. "I can give you a brief statement." She decided. "Excellent." Sharon said, her tone sharp with professionalism. "Can you confirm that you were removed from your first-class seat by a flight attendant despite having paid for it?" "That's correct, Aaliyah," replied her voice, calm yet resolute. "I was targeted and humiliated because of the color of my skin. The flight attendant abused her authority to demean me, then tried to cover it up by fabricating a seating issue. And what do you plan to do?" Next, Sharon asked, pressing for more. "I'm pursuing legal action." Aaliyah stated without hesitation, "This is bigger than me. It's without ensuring no one else has to endure this kind of treatment. People in positions of authority need to be held accountable." Sharon thanked her and ended the call, leaving Aaliyah with a mix of anticipation and determination. She knew her words would pour more fuel on the fire, and that was exactly her intent when she finally arrived back home. Aaliyah barely had time to set down her bag before her phone rang again. This time it was her attorney, Charles Porter. "Aaliyah," Charles began, his tone serious but composed, "I've been following this situation closely. The backlash against the airline is mounting rapidly. We have an opportunity to act now, leverage their vulnerability for either a settlement or a full lawsuit." "I want to sue," Aaliyah said firmly. "No settlements. They need to face real consequences for this." "Understood," Charles replied, his voice unwavering. "But prepare yourself. They'll try to discredit you, dig into your past, spin anything they can to shift blame." "Let them," Aaliyah said coolly. "I have nothing to hide." Meanwhile, at the airline's corporate offices, chaos reigned. Rachel Bennett, the legal advisor who had previously reached out to Aaliyah, stood in a tense meeting with the company's PR and executive teams. The video footage of Aaliyah's removal, combined with her public statements, had plunged the airline into damage control mode. "This is an unmitigated disaster." One executive said, slamming his hand on the table, "That video's got over 1 million views, and every major news outlet is running with it." What was Natalie thinking? "We need to act fast," Rachel interjected. "I've already reached out to Miss Johnson to discuss a resolution, but she's not interested in a quiet settlement." The room fell silent as her words hung in the air. Then another executive finally spoke. "We need a scapegoat, someone to take the fall for this." Rachel's lips thinned in disapproval. "That's already happening. Natalie Parker has a history of complaints, and this incident will end her career. But if we don't navigate this carefully, the backlash won't stop with her." "What are you proposing?" Someone asked, "We issue a formal apology and announce an internal review of our policies," Rachel explained. "But we need to be ready for a lawsuit. Miss Johnson's not going to back down back in her apartment." Aaliyah was reviewing her notes and organizing a timeline of events when a notification pinged on her phone. The airline had just released a statement on social media. She clicked on it, her eyes narrowing as she read. "We are aware of the incident involving Aaliyah Johnson on Flight 347 and are conducting a thorough investigation. We take these matters seriously and are committed to ensuring that all passengers are treated with dignity and respect. We sincerely apologize for any distress caused and are working to address the situation." Aaliyah scoffed. The statement was textbook corporate damage control, carefully crafted to sound concerned, while minimizing liability. It didn't impress her. Her phone buzzed again. A message from Michael, who had been by her side throughout the ordeal. Don't let up. If read, a small, grim smile crossed her lips. Michael was right. The airline's sterile apology wasn't going to cut it. Not with her and not with the public. Real change required sustained pressure. Opening her laptop, began drafting a statement of her own. If the airline thought they could wrest control of the narrative, they were about to learn just how wrong they were. Momentum continued to build. News outlets picked up, Aaliyah's story, interview request, poured in, and social media erupted. With discussions about her case, legal analysts weighed in on the implications and hashtags calling for justice trended online. Natalie, Parker's name had entered the fray. Her history of misconduct, aggravating the controversy, reports of prior complaints against her surfaced, sinking the airline deeper into scrutiny for Aaliyah. The fight was just beginning, but every moment strengthened. Her resolve, justice didn't seem far-fetched anymore. It felt inevitable. The next morning, Aaliyah woke to a flood of notifications. Her phone buzzed incessantly with messages, mentions, and calls. Michael's video had gone viral overnight, making the incident a global topic. Seated at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee, Aaliyah scrolled through the avalanche of updates. Articles speculated about Natal's behavior, opinion pieces condemned the airline, and hashtags demanded systemic reforms. Her inbox was filled with emails from reporters and activists seeking to collaborate or amplify her voice. Her phone rang again. It was Charles Porter morning. Charles, she greeted, setting her mug down. Morning, Aaliyah. He replied, his tone sharp and focused. I've reviewed the video and your documentation. We're in an excellent position. The airline's apology won't withstand the public backlash sooner or later. They'll be forced to respond to a lawsuit. They're already scrambling, Aaliyah said as she leaned back in her chair. But I'm not interested in their performative apologies. Good, Charles said. I've drafted a formal demand letter, but need your final approval before sending it. I've also lined up interviews with legal analysts to proactively support your case in the media. Send me the draft, Aaliyah said. I'll review it today. After ending the call, she received another notification, a new video. A former flight attendant had come forward. Aaliyah clicked on the link, her stomach tightening. As the woman began speaking, my name is Lauren Davis. The woman said, her voice steady but tinged with emotion. I worked with Natalie Parker for over 3 years. What happened to MS Johnson doesn't surprise me at all. Natalie has a history of targeting passengers, especially people of color. I reported her behavior multiple times, but nothing was ever done. Lauren continued recounting specific incidents of abuse, each one reinforcing Aaliyah's case and exposing the airline's failures. By the time the video ended, Aaliyah's anger had flared anew. The airlines. Negligence had allowed Natalie's behavior to fester, unchecked, and now it was unraveling across town. In a cramped apartment, Natalie Parker sat in a growing state of panic. Legal documents cluttered the space, and her laptop played endless news coverage of the scandal. Her name was splashed across headlines, and social media reeled with demands for her firing. Even her neighbors had begun to avoid her. Her phone buzzed. She hesitated before answering. Natalie, Rachel Bennett's curt voice came through the line. We need to discuss damage control. Damage control. Natalie snapped, defensive and exhausted. What about my side of the story? There is no side of the story that justifies your actions. Rachel said bluntly, the video speaks for itself, and several employees have come forward with additional allegations. You've put us in an impossible position. I was following protocol. Natalie argued, her voice rising. She didn't belong in first class. I was just doing my job enough. Rachel interrupted, her tone icy. Your behavior has caused massive PAR damage. We're staring down a potential lawsuit, and if other passengers come forward, it could grow into a class action. Frankly, you're lucky. We haven't terminated you yet. Natalie's breath caught as the gravity of her situation truly hit her. What do you expect me to do? She asked, her voice muted. You're being placed on unpaid leave effective immediately. Rachel stated, her words devoid of sympathy. You're not to speak to the media or issue any public statements. The airline will release a more detailed apology and conduct its own investigation into your behavior. And Natalie. This isn't up for debate before Natalie could respond. The call ended, leaving her staring at her phone in stunned disbelief back in her apartment. Aaliyah felt a renewed sense of purpose. Natalie's reckoning was just one step in a much larger fight ahead, but Allah was prepared now, more than ever, to see it through to the end. Aaliyah was sipping her second cup of coffee when her phone buzzed. It was Michael. His voice was brimming with energy. "Have you seen the latest?" he asked, barely able to contain himself. "If you mean the former flight attendant's video, then yes." Aaliyah's tone was calm, yet there was a spark of satisfaction in her voice. "It's blowing up," Michael said. "And it's not just her, more employees are coming forward with similar stories. This isn't just a scandal anymore. It's turning into a reckoning." Aaliyah leaned back in her chair, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "Good," she said firmly. "The more people speak out, the harder it'll be for the airline." To bury this, Michael hesitated. "You ready for what's next? This is going to get even bigger and messier before it gets better." Aaliyah's jaw tightened as her determination solidified. "I'm ready." She said they started this. "I'm going to finish it by midday." The story had reached a boiling point. The airline issued a second public apology, this time acknowledging Natalie's behavior and promising a thorough review of company policies. But the statement landed flat, prompting a wave of backlash. Critics accused the company of scapegoating a single employee instead of addressing the systemic problems that enabled such behavior. As Aaliyah scrolled through the responses online, her phone buzzed again. It was a text from Charles' demand letter sent. "Expect their legal team's response shortly. Stay strong." She stared at the text for a moment, setting her phone down with quiet focus. The path ahead wasn't going to be easy, but she had no intention of backing down, Natalie, and the airline had underestimated her resolve. That was their mistake. Aaliyah opened her laptop to draft a new public statement addressing the growing conversation around structural racism in corporate America. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. This battle was about something much bigger, and she was ready to carry it forward later. That afternoon, Aaliyah sat across from Charles Porter in his sleek downtown office. Sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, highlighting the rows of bookshelves stocked with legal volumes, though he appeared calm. Charles leaned forward, his hands clasped on the desk. His voice measured the airline's lawyers. "We'll likely try to settle?" He said. "They'll offer a sum large enough to tempt you, hoping the money and a quick resolution will silence this whole thing." He fixed her with a firm gaze. "Are you ready to say no if they do, without question?" Aya replied without hesitation. "This isn't about the money. It's about real accountability." Charles nodded approvingly. "Good. That's the stance we need to maintain once we move forward with the lawsuit. Things are going to get intense. Their legal team will dig into your past, your life, anything they can use to discredit you." Aaliyah met his gaze squarely, her confidence unwavering. "I have nothing to hide." He leaned back in his chair, a faint smile crossing his lips. "That's exactly what I wanted to hear now about building our case. If more passengers or former employees come forward, it'll give us even more leverage. And, judging by the way the videos are being shared, that's already happening." Their conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. Charles's assistant stepped in, holding a tablet. "You're going to want to see this," she said, handing it to him. Charles played the video on the screen. A former airline employee, a man in his early 40s, sat at a desk with a sober expression. "I worked for the airline for 10 years. The man said, his voice calm, but filled with emotion. "I personally witnessed Natalie Parker harass passengers, especially people of color. She always claimed she was enforcing policy, but it was obvious what was really happening. I reported her several times, but nothing ever came of it. Management always looked the other way, like her behavior didn't matter." Charles paused the video and set the tablet down. "This," he said, "is exactly what we need. It's no longer just about what did to you. It's about what they allowed her to keep doing." Aaliyah exhaled, steadying the storm of emotions. Building within her anger, sadness, resolve, they all surged together. They knew she said quietly, they knew she was harming people, and they let it happen. Meanwhile, at the airline's headquarters, tensions were at an all-time high. Rachel Bennett sat at the head of the conference table, surrounded by senior executives whose frustration was palpable. "This is spiraling out of control," one executive said, slamming his fist on the table. "We've got former employees accusing the company of systemic racism, public backlash growing by the minute, and now people are calling for a boycott. We need a plan." Rachel stayed composed, her tone sharp. "The first step is terminating Natalie Parker's contract and making that announcement public. Leaving her on unpaid leave isn't enough anymore." And then what another executive snapped. "We throw her under the bus and hope it blows over. What about Aaliyah Johnson? She's..." Not backing down, Rachel's jaw tightened. "We'll have to make her an offer. A generous one if she won't settle. We prepare for the fallout. Letting this go to court could be devastating." "For us," one executive leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples, "so we sacrifice Natalie, make some promises to review policies and pray. This doesn't stick." Rachel stayed silent. She knew the truth. Their actions wouldn't be enough to satisfy the public. This battle wasn't going to simmer down quietly that evening. Aaliyah returned to her apartment to find Michael waiting outside. He was pacing, phone in hand, unable to stay still as she approached. He turned his face, lit with urgency. "Natalie Parker," he started. "She'd been officially fired." Aaliyah narrowed her eyes. "Let me guess they think that one move will make everything disappear." Michael nodded. "Exactly, but it's not working. People are still calling for an investigation into the company." Aaliyah unlocked her door, motioning for him to follow her inside. "Good. The more pressure, the better. They can't just sweep this under the rug anymore." Once inside, Michael pulled up the latest social media post on his phone and handed it to her. "You're trending again," he said with a grin. The post was a clip of Aaliyah's speech to reporters paired with the bold headline, "Aaliyah Johnson takes on airline discrimination." Aaliyah studied the screen for a moment, then set the phone down. Her expression was serious, but there was a flicker of hope in her eyes. "They think firing Natalie is enough, but they're wrong. This isn't just about her. It's about the system that let her act with impunity." Michael nodded, with admiration. "So what's next?" "We keep pushing." Aaliyah said, "We won't stop until they're forced to make real changes and admit their role in this." As the days passed, the momentum grew. More testimonies surfaced, more voices joined the fight, and the airline found itself cornered. Aaliyah knew there was still a long way to go, but with every step forward, she felt the power of collective action in a society too often divided by hate and complacency. Her stand meant something bigger than herself. It served as a reminder. Empathy and accountability weren't just ideals to aspire to. They were responsibilities we all shared, and together real change was possible. The public was demanding more than apologies, press releases, or half-hearted promises of reform. They want real change. An executive said his frustration was evident. Another leaned forward, voice sharp. "What's the solution?" "Overhaul our entire training program. Fire half the staff." Rachel Bennett's gaze was unflinching as she responded. "We start by settling with Miss Johnson. A public trial will destroy us. She has witnesses, video evidence, and the full weight of public opinion behind her. We can't win in court." The room grew heavy with silence as the reality of her words set in. Finally, the CEO spoke, his tone clipped. "Fine, make her an offer, but include a confidentiality clause. If this goes public, it's over for us." Later that day, Aaliyah answered yet another call. This one from Rachel herself. "Miss Johnson, this is Rachel Bennett representing the airline. I'd like to discuss a possible resolution." "I'm listening," Aaliyah replied coolly. Rachel's tone was measured. "We're prepared to offer a significant settlement and a formal public apology for your experience and a gag order." Aaliyah asked. Her grip on the phone tightened after a beat of hesitation. Rachel replied, "We would expect confidentiality as part of the agreement. This would allow us to focus on implementing meaningful changes without further distractions." Aaliyah laughed bitterly. "Meaningful changes? You mean sweeping this under the rug?" No, Miss Johnson. We take your allegations seriously. Rachel said, her voice strained. This settlement is an acknowledgement of our commitment to do better. I don't want your hush money, Aaliyah retorted. I want accountability, public accountability. Your airline allowed Natalie Parker and others like her to operate unchecked for years. This is about everyone who has suffered from your negligence. This can't be silenced anymore. Rachel's voice grew tighter, betraying hints of desperation. A trial will be difficult for everyone involved. Long, expensive, and painful settling would enable us to move forward. I'm not afraid of a trial, Aaliyah said coldly, but maybe your executives should be. She hung up before Rachel could respond as Aaliyah set down her phone. Her heart raced, but her resolve was firm. This wasn't about money. It was about just that evening. Michael Rivera called, his voice buzzing with energy. You're not going to believe this. Aaliyah, a major civil rights organization, just reached out. They want to back your case financially and legally. Aaliyah slumped in her chair, a small smile breaking through her exhaustion. That's amazing, Michael, with their help. We can make this even bigger, Michael chuckled. Aaliyah, you're becoming the Phi of a movement. She paused, her voice soft but steady. I never asked for that, but if that's what it takes to make real change, I'll do it. The days leading up to the trial were a blur of preparation, media frenzy, and growing tension. Interviews with former employees, damning social media exposes, and calls for boycotts had thrown the airline into damage control. Meanwhile, Aaliyah and her legal team, led by attorney Charles Avery, worked tirelessly to secure their case for every attempt by the airline to dismiss her claims as isolated incidents. They countered with compelling testimonies and damning evidence of systemic negligence, and then the trial began. Aaliyah entered the courthouse head held high, surrounded by reporters, activists, and supporters inside the courtroom. Buzzed, filled with anticipation, on one side sat the airline's crack legal team, led by Rachel, their faces unreadable. On the other sat Aaliyah, her hands steady as she reviewed notes with Charles from the outset. Her lawyer delivered a sharp opening statement, weaving a narrative of persistent discrimination enabled by the airline's inaction. Charles argued that Natalie Parker's behavior was not an isolated case, but the byproduct of a toxic, unchecked culture. Witness after witness followed, substantiating his claims. The courtroom listened as a former flight attendant, Lauren Davis, testified about repeated incidents of misconduct by Natalie and others. I reported her multiple times. Lauren said, her voice firm, but management always brushed it under the rug. They cared more about PR than protecting employees or passengers. When it was Aaliyah's turn to testify, she spoke with a quiet strength that riveted the room. She recounted the pain of that single flight, but made it clear. This was about more than her. Too many have been humiliated, silenced, or dismissed. I stood up not just for me, but for everyone who's been marginalized because of their race or identity. Her words left a lasting impact and a conviction in the room that this was no misunderstanding. The airline's legal team tried their best to discredit the claims, painting Natalie's actions as a rogue event and Aaliyah as an opportunist. But Aaliyah remained calm, dismantling their challenges with facts and poise. By the time the trial concluded, the public and press alike were no longer on the fence. The airline's toxic culture stood exposed, and Aaliyah's courage had inspired a movement for justice and accountability, not just within this industry, but across the nation, ending months after the trial. A resolution was reached, but by then, the outcome had transcended the courtroom. Aaliyah's determination had sparked sweeping changes within the airline industry and beyond. Policies were rewritten, diversity training was revamped, and employees who had long been silenced found the courage to speak out for Aaliyah. The fight had never been about fame or revenge. It was about change. In one interview, she concluded with a statement that resonated across the country. Prejudice thrives in systems that refuse to confront it. But together, we've proven that change begins when people demand accountability. This journey taught me that courage isn't about fearlessness. It's about standing firm, even when it's hard, Communities rallied together, inspired to challenge injustice in their own spaces, though the scars of the past remained. The movement Arya had catalyzed left a inching impact, showing that real progress begins with the bold choice to speak out, not just for yourself, but for everyone whose voice has been ignored. And in that truth, there was a light that could not be extinguished. In the wake of Aaliyah's courageous decision to confront the injustice she faced, her story sparked a powerful wave of dialogue across the nation. People from all walks of life united to condemn the prejudice she endured, demanding accountability not only from the airline but from society. As a whole, the airline was forced to issue a public apology and implement mandatory anti-bias training for its staff, while Natalie Parker was held accountable for her actions. Aaliyah's resilience became a symbol of hope and a reminder that silence feeds discrimination, but speaking up can ignite change. In the end, her endurance highlighted a powerful truth. When individuals and communities stand together against injustice, they have the power to forge a more equitable future for all.